Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Economic and Community Development Committee meeting. Today is Monday, February 13th, 2023. Let's go ahead and get started. I am joined today by my colleagues to my left, Councilmember Michaud and Councilmember Larmer. Moving on to approval of the agenda, do we have any changes from staff or council? All right. We will then get started with the business of our meeting today. And the first item is the approval of our minutes from the January 9th, 2023 meeting.
Chair, I move to approve minutes from January 9th, 2023.
Second.
All right. I have a motion and a second. Seeing no discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
So we unanimously approve the minutes for the meeting on January 9th. Moving on to item number B, which is the Wagner Architects and Planners KEHOC designs. I'd like to welcome Will. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me at the ECD committee. I'm Will Moore, the facilities superintendent. So as that says, I'm here to present and request approval for the Wagner Architects and Planners Design and Construction Administration contract for KEHOC, which stands for Kent East Hill Operations Center. This building will serve our Public Works, Parks, and Police Department, which is why you'll see some of them in attendance as well. It's a big team effort so far. And KEHOC is located, if you're not familiar, up on East Hill, as the name suggests, on 248th and 124th. It's about a 22-acre site, and the city acquired it back in 1999. And after acquiring it, the city spent a lot of time and effort in the early 2000s going through a massive planning effort to develop that site. There was plans for an administration building, a fleet maintenance building, a big warehouse, fuel island. It was a huge operations center that was a lot of effort was put into it back in the early 2000s again. So part of the reason, and back then it was actually Wagner Architects that was the original architect and planner for that site, and he's still in operation today. It made a lot of sense to continue to work with him and pick up those plans where they left off, but with some fairly large changes in terms of consolidation, which I'll talk a little bit about more. And so, unfortunately, the city wasn't able to move forward with that larger operations center back in the early 2000s. So, fast forward about 20 years later now, we have a huge opportunity to move forward with a more consolidated single building that houses Public Works, Parks, and Police, actually. So, it's a multi-function building that really helps the operations of these teams that support the major infrastructures of the city itself. And so, again, between now and the early 2000s, we've actually invested a lot into that site to get us to this point. We've actually installed underground utilities. There's water, sewer, and actually storm as well. And they installed that with the same footprint from the original master plan. So we have good infrastructure already in place to be able to support this next step and actually building this larger operations building. And so if you've been up to that site currently, like I said, we installed the utilities, but our Parks and Public Works teams use that site as it stands. But when we moved in 20 years ago, the thought was we would develop the whole site with these other buildings, but that hasn't happened, and the site up there with those portable units are in really bad condition. The teams are not, it's either something has to be done with this or with that. So you can see the site for yourself up there as well. And so everything's beyond its useful life. In addition to that, the existing shops building at Russell Road, we've completely outgrown that space for the teams. You kind of see an example of that. There was another portable installed down there, but it's not like we can keep installing portables all over the place. And same goes for police. They use the jail actually here for their evidence storage, and if you walk in there, it's overflowing. And they've even had to install Connex boxes throughout the city at different sites as well. So again, it's one of those things like portables, Connex, we're out of space for not only storage, but also for the teams. So this multi-function building is really the solution to support the growing city and the teams and the infrastructure. So I ask that you please approve this contract for Wagner Architects and Planners for $2,462,014 for the design, permitting, bidding, and construction phase services for the new KEHOC development. That's basically beginning to end with that project. Any questions, please?
Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I know several of us have been up to that property, and it definitely is in need of a huge overhaul, and this would be a great use for expanding that property. So any questions from my colleagues?
I do have a question. So the 2.4 million, that is inclusive of everything?
Correct. That's it. We're still, this is scope development is still processing this, but that is our high-end marks. We're going high on it, and then we'll dial it down as needed.
Okay, great,
Yep.
thank you.
All right, Councilmember Michaud, do you have a motion?
Yes, Madam Chair. I move to recommend to Council the authorization of a consultant service agreement with Wagner Architects and Planners in an amount not to exceed $2,462,014, subject to final terms and conditions acceptable to the Parks Director and City Attorney.
Second?
All right, there's been a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, seeing no opposed, motion passes unanimously. Thank you
Thank you.
very much. All right, moving on in the agenda to item number C, which is the 2021 Countywide Planning Policy Amendments, and welcome to Kristen.
Thank you. Good evening. Tonight before you, I have the 2021 Countywide Planning Policy Amendments. This year they're relatively short. Just a little bit of background. So we as a city participate with the rest of the cities in the county, in King County, to adopt growth targets. And we do this through the GMPC, Growth Management Planning Council. And one of the things that we do is we do a large evaluation process about every 10 years. During that process, last year we adopted the 2019 through 2044 growth targets. However, in that adoption process, King County had said that Sammamish's targets needed to be reevaluated a little bit further due to the utility infrastructure and some deficiencies that they had. And so last year, you all ratified the growth targets for Kent as well as all of the other cities and unincorporated county minus Sammamish. And so this amendment, Sammamish worked with the county and with their consultants to better analyze what their realistic growth targets were. And so this amendment is simply adding in Sammamish. It does not affect us or any other jurisdiction, but in order for them to be ratified, because it's a countywide document, several cities, there's a formula of 30% of cities representing 70% of the population must ratify the resolution for it to become adopted. And so I'm here tonight to present the resolution and ask for you to voice support so that we can move forward with our comprehensive plan updates.
All right, thank you. So just a little bit of housekeeping.
Exactly. Really no consequence to us at all, but we do, I wanted you to have the full context of what you're being asked to vote on and why we are meddling apparently with what looks like Sammamish, but really it's just clarifying some update language.
All right, any questions from my colleagues? All right, seeing none, a motion would be in order.
Chair, I move to adopt a resolution number to be assigned by the city clerk, ratifying an amendment to the 2021 King County Countywide Planning Policies adopted by King County through Ordinance 19553, updating the growth targets for the city of Sammamish.
Second?
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Since there is none opposed, it passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Kristen. And next, we have an information-only item. Bill is going to talk to us about the Flex Fund contracts with National Development Council.
And commercial affordability more broadly, since it's been a few months since we discussed that. The common denominator between that and this project has been the National Development Council. You had a presentation with them for the Flex Fund, but I've been partnering with them in additional ways. I've been talking to them. You might remember we worked with Green River College to bring on a permit technical assistance support. That was an outgrowth of King County's pilot for commercial affordability. So what I'm here to do and talk about today, to give some update, is to revisit that topic and talk about why we think there's a steep upfront barrier to improving our buildings and getting them tenanted with small businesses. What we've tried to do in the last few months And recently, a King County grant that I talked about at full council just a week ago at ECD update. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail because I think it's relevant to how the city and council may still deploy ARPA funding that is already allocated for the topic of commercial affordability going forward. So information only today, but I think it will lead to a project and scopes of work in near future. So just to revisit, and this is an old slide, definition. What is commercial affordability? How does it relate to commercial displacement? So commercial affordability, you should be able to afford about 6 to 10% of your small business revenue on rent. However, it has been the case that with rising rents, you're seeing displacement of existing businesses sometimes, and this leads to conversations of gentrification, specifically in Seattle. However, as I referenced, the pilot project also took place with a focus on South King County, because the rents have been growing for commercial spaces across the board also, so it's a relative term. However, I think a lot of the conversation from a policy perspective on commercial affordability is talking about access to capital, talking about access to technical assistance, and it's just inclusive of a wide range of entrepreneur challenges. And while we've talked about commercial displacement a lot, there's continued to be conversations about businesses that were displaced by housing and CTAC, or projects along the Light Link rail line. It's been mostly, I think the observation I want to have for South King County is not so much a displacement by rising rents, as I have observed that small businesses have challenges to being placed. So in some ways, the same solutions that are posited for just preventing businesses from being displaced are actually the same economic development toolkit to help businesses get placed into vacant spaces as well. So that's a commonality. I just like throwing this up as eye candy. There's a lot of math involved with actually whether or not displacement's happening in your community. We don't have the data to even begin to approach that. But this is a much simpler chart that I think we can rest our hat on. And this is, in fact, what National Development Council looked at, which is, and it's backward looking, of course. This is from 2019, but this is when they initiated the pilot back in 2020. So that's how long we've had a conversation with National Development Council and with King County around these issues. 3 years now, through the pandemic and then beyond. So as spaces were getting bigger, so as the new construction was creating more retail spaces, especially in mixed-use projects where they're sort of forced by urban planning rules to have ground floor urban activation and bigger lease spaces, they were less and less viable. There was just more to lease, and they became less and less attainable. Meanwhile, the access to capital in South King County has been difficult. You can see that the amount of lending that you can observe in South King County to small businesses is substantially less than King County as a whole. Somewhere 6 times high as 60% less. So these four organizations, National Development Council, Craft 3, who worked with us on our emergency business grants, Moving Beyond, and BDS Planning and Urban Design, were those who were behind the pilot project at King County, but have also been continuing their work in the city of Seattle. National Development Council and Craft 3 are community development financial institutions. Moving Beyond is a DEI a consulting expert that was brought on by NDC to talk about how they can improve equitable lending. And BDS Planning and Urban Design had a role to say because a lot of what they were looking at was brick and mortar business, not businesses that were just online businesses, but businesses that had to go through a permit process or construction of some sort. So again, for the reasons for the pilot was that there was certainly displacement of existing businesses in Seattle. It was also posited that that was happening in South King County. As I've observed, though, there are data limitations to really telling that story. However, I think it's notable that something I see on an anecdotal basis, just trying to move businesses into vacant storefronts or existing storefronts or just an existing business trying to expand, a lot of the same issues. And so even in the pilot, we put forward sort of the permit tech assistance expert. We put forward other business owners who have been thwarted in their desires to expand because the barriers to doing construction is really high. So what NDC was brought to bear with funding both public and philanthropic, funding from the city of Seattle, funding from King County, not funding from the city of Kent at that point, was technical assistance, primarily financial. Principally what they learned was most valuable was assistance through the permit process. Their findings were around, most generally, that there are challenges at the tenanting part. So a lot of tenant improvements are put upon the business owner by the property owner. So if you're trying to bring in a kitchen, let's say, a commercial kitchen, it can be quite daunting to put in a hood and a grease trap interceptor and these things that you've maybe never even heard of before before you intended to start a business. And the expenses, and we have a new data analyst, GIS analyst in ECD now. His name's Dan Blinko. We're really excited to have him on board. One of his early tasks, I think, will be mining our existing data to go see what is the typical valuation for a small business owner to start up in Kent. How much does it cost to turn the lights on to a space that we think could be spruced up? How long are those permit timelines? And try to pinpoint that more accurately. That's going to take time. It's going to take time to assemble the data. But there were some broader findings that I'm sure we could generalize that would also apply in Kent from these other projects. And the other finding, of course, is not a surprising one, feeling that if a business had a path to ownership, a business was in better position financially and more stable. So several of the additional findings of their work, the white paper, is that the projects seeking more than $250,000 but less than $1 million have the most trouble finding debt. There's a lack of collateral, there's higher risk, and from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint, business owners who may come from backgrounds that are less likely to have family wealth might have a harder time coming up with the collateral. One of the very most common ways for a small business to get off the ground, to lease space, to execute a lease, to do all the costly tenant improvements that various codes require, is raising money from family and friends, which can pose a challenge if you don't have the money in the first place, or from a family inheritance, or from within your personal network. So there's an equity challenge there. So space is either shell or also an older condition of disrepair. So this is different than Seattle. So in South King County, a lot of times you have properties that are in a poor state, poor condition. The rents haven't supported a lot of maintenance. I'm thinking specifically of the historic buildings of our early turn of the century, the last turn of the century, 1900s buildings in our historic downtown, but also in a lot of our strip malls and strip centers built in the 70s or 80s. The rents haven't supported a lot of reinvestment all the time, and so a lot of that falls on the entrepreneur. So even though the economic conditions in Seattle and Kent are quite different, there is a commonality or universality on this component, and so I think that's the reason why we're talking about this today in Kent. So the development process is also just not a common experience for most business owners, right? Especially if you're a new business, or even if you've had a business for a long time. The last time you may have come to the permit counter and done a big expansion work could be never or 10 years ago, and codes change every year. So it's just not a common experience. And there's a navigation of the construction process at any scale. It can be very intense and very specialized. So level setting expectations with applicants were some of the key findings that they got out of their pilots. Other highlights: credit enhancements, grant funding, debt finding, bidding and acquiring property. These are all of the things that need help often to get a small business person who isn't really well resourced in the beginning or doesn't have a lot of existing experiences to a position to even open. So some of the technical assistance areas: architectural design, financial literacy, business development. Do you have a business plan? A lot of times people may charge ahead and they have like the perfect recipe for such and such. They may not have always the perfect business plan to commercialize that product. They may also not have architectural CAD drawing skills, or public energy code skills, or the construction management skills to watch a general contractor. So there's a variety of things that an entrepreneur is hats they're asked to wear besides just managing their business. And they might find that at the very first point at the permit counter, which is, of course, where the city could find a role. But additionally, the city can find a role in sort of the funding and the subsidy up front. So the envisioned role of CDFIs has been technical assistance. They often employ dozens of technical assistance experts on small business who are available on call. Financing is a core competency of the CDFI, but also they can identify the funding gaps of after the owner contribution, debt, other resources are all exhausted. They can kind of solve for X and said, all right, we're still short this much for this business owner to get started into this space, into this new construction. They can help identify that. What they really can't do are two things that are, I think they envision more of a role of local governments and municipalities. This is all referencing the NDC report from the work of the last couple of years. One is creating the space. So actually having property available that commercial businesses can afford is difficult. Finding, bidding, and acquiring property in a crowded landscape is very challenging. So creating platforms or creating opportunities either on existing properties or sort of working through their policy levers to make sure those spaces available is one role envisioned for government. Another is directly investing in the CDFI themselves to create the gap financing. So the Flex Fund is something where we did that. We purchased down the cost of equity, so we enabled the interest rates of the CDFIs could have offer in Kent at a lower interest payment. We could do something similar in construction. So we tried that. We tried by asking for some money collaboratively with the City of Seattle to the State Business Innovation Fund grant. One-time grant they made available. I think I referenced this at council. It was like $34 million, a third of it reserved for King County. I was talking with my colleagues at the City of Seattle. I was talking with National Development Council, who's doing a lot of work with the City of Seattle around specifically tenant improvement projects, trying to help fund and grant and provide lower interest loans for businesses moving into projects, specifically affordable housing projects, and also pre-development costs. So covering some of the very heady things that need to happen at the forefront of moving a brick and mortar business in, hiring the architect, hiring the construction management team, having a plan of the golden path through the permit process. All of those major buckets we put forward in a grant application together. We were denied, but we don't mind having done that. I think you always learn a lot by going through the process of writing a grant. You learn, basically forces you to write a work plan and learn what others are doing and then what you could do differently. So it was also a rare chance for the City of Kent and the City of Seattle to apply on something together collaboratively, and a shared notion, a shared understanding that the business community members that we were working with were often same, they're related, they all knew each other, they were working with same people in one economy. So I bring this up after that slide because I want to focus, and it's kind of hard to see, and I apologize as always. Now if I have a little laser pointer here. Nope, I don't. In this budget chart, you'll see pre-development funds is one of the categories on the third level down. It's the bulk of what we asked for the City of Kent. And the reason I put the bulk of the funding for our grant application that was unsuccessful in pre-development costs was a fewfold. Kent is actually interesting in that we have a lot of public surplus property coming to market. Yes, our Naden property, right, that we're in negotiation on. Additionally, though, there's also the Sound Transit RFP process, which is now open. And we are also trying to work with the school district on some of the property that they have near Mill Creek Middle School. So we have a lot of opportunity, actually, in one of the finding areas that was most difficult. One of the finding areas that was most difficult was just acquiring and making available the space, right? That was one of the roles of the government, was to find space in a crowded market environment. The next step of that is pre-developing it. And so that was where the bulk of our ask was. We don't have a tenant improvement program like Seattle, but we were also looking like, could we share best practices? And the other thing we don't have, similar to Seattle, is the City of Seattle Office of Economic Development. It's a standalone department with 40-plus staff to execute things like tenant improvement programs. We were looking at partnerships potentially with NDC to be the administrator of that type of grant program, similarly here. They're the advisor in how that program is set up in Seattle, but the City of Seattle actually administers it. In our case, we were looking at how could NDC take a step further for us and actually help us administer because of staff capacity. So that was in September. We found out late November, early December that we didn't have that grant opportunity. I had come to council in August and talked about moving some of the Flex Fund money over to commercial affordability, about $1 million. This was announced a couple weeks ago, and I want to highlight it because there's some similarities that I think are very interesting and useful as we think about continuing to develop the funding that we do have available for pre-development cost coverage for commercial affordability. Racism is a public health emergency was something announced by King County in 2020. There's several buckets of grants within this, right? There's general grants for community service providers, there's small business grants, there's physical infrastructure grants, and then there's capacity building grants for community service providers. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the similarities and differences of a couple of these grant application categories from King County to what I just described that we tried for with Seattle, because I think it's relevant to seeing what we do next. So some of the themes of the commercial affordability are present in the grant application categories here from King County, not universally all of them. Specifically, the coverage of pre-development costs is what I want to focus in on, because I'm going to come back to the previous slide, but If you look here under eligible uses, site identification, broker fees, feasibility and due diligence studies, appraisal, environmental assessment, developer consultant fees, architecture fees, engineering fees, soil sampling, site control, land holding costs, contractor, legal, proposal, other consultant fees, earnest money, pre-development related to rehabilitating an existing building, and community planning to design the project. Okay, these are all eligible uses, plus acquisition and construction is an eligible use of this grant fund. Wow. You can see how many different things you ask a small entrepreneur to take on when you ask them to open into an, you can see the barrier of entry for entrepreneurship just by that list. And so physical infrastructure is something that this grant is looking to cover. That physical infrastructure grant, though, isn't focused necessarily on businesses from King County. And I just wanted to point out, and this is these are all laudable categories. I just want to say that, again, while the intended use of the funds is similar, the policy reason for doing so is a little bit different than what we've talked about. This is narrower in the sense that it is looking specifically at Black Americans who are the descendants of enslaved Africans and indigenous populations. It is specifically looking for physical locations for healthcare and wellness service programs. It's looking specifically for permanently affordable social and multi-generational housing. But this is the key point here, with mixed-use commercial and community space that promote vibrant communities. That second half of that sentence, they got a little asterisk there. It says these funds would be flexible to support the construction of both residential and non-residential components of the project. That's really significant because generally with affordable housing projects, their financing does not mix well with ground floor businesses. It actually undercuts the affordability of many affordable housing tools to have to bring in a business, let alone do any other subsidy to that business. So having additional funds available to them is a complement to the affordable housing investment. It needs a different type of subsidy to complement. And so that was something I wanted to draw out here. Of course, at the same time, I have heard a lot from our community members. I've heard a lot from community business or community benefit organizations, from cultural groups, that they very much want more physical infrastructure for their event hall space, for gatherings of their communities. They want a pathway to ownership for their organizations. And so that was some of the things that have informed, I think, what I would like to talk in future and get your guidance on in terms of policy prescription about how do we spend our own ARPA funds in a similar vein of commercial affordability, nonprofits or businesses both. This is more focused on housing, but it also talks about healthcare clinics. I've met with organizations that have been focused on trying to deliver health care specifically to the Black community, like the Tubman Center for Health and Wellness. This seems like it would be a pretty good grant target for them and for others like them. So I wanted to highlight that. But then there's also King County Small Business Grant is another category specifically for businesses. And it doesn't call out pre-development costs here, but it does talk about what are ineligible expenses, and it does talk about the amount of the award for businesses that have been disadvantaged. And it does talk about, this is a key phrase here, I'm sorry, it's in small print. I just took this over from their own application. All grantees will be required to commit to providing specific benefit to the King County community in exchange for the awarded funding, and will be required to provide periodic reports for the public benefits provided. What are public benefits? Public benefits must be concrete and specific and may look like paying living wages to employees, purchasing locally to further support the local economy, providing subsidized low-cost goods and or services to customers who may not be able to afford those goods and services. Additionally, all businesses will be required to commit to staying open during the contract period. These are awards up to $100,000. Again, also focusing primarily on Black Americans and Indigenous Americans. Those are the focal or points of emphasis populations, although others are allowed to also apply. And the rest of the application, I haven't included all of it here, talks a lot about the story of the business or the story of the organization applying. So this is an interesting target, I think, for a lot of Kent businesses as well, and really want to get the word out and try to support them in making applications and having funding come to our community. But I think this dovetails to the conversation I've started with Council about the ARPA funding that we have allocated, the $1 million, and the conversation we've already begun with National Development Council, and thinking about how do we best leverage those funds to achieve policy aims of, yes, addressing racism, systemic racism, and going back to the initial part of the conversation, the barriers to entrepreneurs and to local community cultural organizations to accessing, finding their own way to pathway to ownership, finding their own way to lease. Info only today. It's a big, weighty topic. I thought it would take more than one meeting, frankly, to get there, but I wanted to introduce the topics afresh, give some recap of what we've tried in the meantime to increase the amount of funding available, and go from there. In this vein, I also want to note that we are hiring National Development Council to advise on some of these same issues of underwriting financial advice for the STEM nonprofits. When we talked about the NADA negotiation last at full council, we talked about strengthening the signature of those organizations into the manufacturing project there. And so we are hiring them for some technical assistance in that negotiation that's taking place right now. We will return to council to talk about program development for the larger pre-development assistance package more broadly than NADA, because I think it's important to consider with the West Hill Sound Transit Site developing RFPs out, whoever wins those selections will need help, frankly, to get financing to put into the affordable housing projects that will be a part of that project, ground floor uses. And so it's a complementary potential use. And there are other sites right now in Kent that are kind of stuck, but for, and I use that phrase very, very importantly, because I've talked about tax increment financing with this committee before, but for some of the pre-development work, it's really hard to identify the capital project list that would advance a tax increment finance district. So I would like to talk more about programming those $1 million along these lines. It's not as nice as if we had gotten the SAFE funding. It would have created a larger package, but I think there's still achievable work we can do within the own resources of the city of Kent. And I also wanted to conclude with this, because I just scanned it about an hour ago, because I recognize this gentleman and this woman in the PSBJ, Puget Sound Business Journal, and it's kind of on topic. I recognize them because they've worked on a project called Midtown and Africatown in Capitol Hill with Community Roots Housing. I had taken a tour with Community Roots Housing of their project in Capitol Hill with a local business owner, a local nonprofit here over on Central Avenue, and they talked a lot about the innovative project that had been achieved with this private market developer as a partner up in Capitol Hill. Without getting into all the details of the article, I'm happy to share with it afterwards. What it's done that's very rare, it's a for-market rental project that the ground floor is in condo ownership, so there can be wealth building for the businesses and the owner of the spaces on the ground floor. In this case, a nonprofit art gallery that does a lot of other educational work in the community. It did require government grants to still fill the gap to ownership, and it still required lender approval from the developer to his lenders in order to split the ownership between the market rate apartments above and the ground floor uses. But that's very, very, I can't underscore it enough, it's just very rare that you would get lender approval. They actually turned down a lease with CVS to go in this direction. And I thought that was, again, notable and an interesting model when we're thinking about having inclusive prosperity into the projects that happen in Kent. And so with that, I'm going to yield to questions and just kind of open up questions and conversation around some of the themes that are present here that I think are related and what, from a Kent vantage point, we should be thinking about if we're going to go talk more about program development here.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Any questions or comments from any of you? I just have a question.
Sure.
Can you remind me, there was a program, and I think Michelle's talked about it too, that I think it was a website that the state had put together where businesses could go to get help on, you know, certain business practices if they weren't familiar with things. Is that was that a pilot thing, or is that?
Looking at Michelle now, because I think you might be referencing the Association of Washington Businesses Guidance website, or a different site. Oh, the community navigation program. So yeah, that has launched now as of January. That's a different program in the sense that it's doing language support, it's doing cultural competence support to getting outreach, and there's a little bit of training the trainer in its vision, but it's hiring and paying local community organizations to navigate people to the resources that already exist. That's not the same, though. That sort of technical assistance, I want to differentiate that a little bit from like an architect or a financial planner. A lot of times it's someone who might help you fill out the form to get the technical assistance from an architect or from help navigate you through the process. There's a lot of business owners that don't even know that small business assistance programs even exist. And they may, one great way to reach them that we learned through the pandemic is to work with the organizations that already know them. And rather than just blasting it out on Facebook, free technical assistance this way, actually have people knock on doors, call friends and relations, call through a network tree, and actually work on people's existing networks to get people into the sort of onboarded into the technical assistance system. But actual support for pre-development brick and mortar work, given all the challenges that I listed out in that pre-development costs, that doesn't exist, frankly, and it's expensive. So you have to weigh the opportunity cost in terms of the expense of this. But again, thinking about some of our high-profile locations that are going to be redeveloping near transit and knowing that they're not very complementary, the types of financing for the affordable housing with the ground floor uses, I think it's an important consideration. Well, how are we going to get some of these local business owners into these projects? How are we going to get some of the cultural organizations or nonprofits to afford the ground floor space? If it's daunting to just make the housing component affordable, imagine trying to also then, after the fact, full market rate into these new constructed buildings. That's why a lot of the criticism in Othello Station and elsewhere is like, you build brand new housing near a train station and then you have the AT&T store or sort of generic phone stores, and it wasn't feeling like there were services and programs for the existing neighborhood. That's the thread that takes you back to the commercial displacement conversations or the commercial affordability conversation. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a different, it's related in the realm of business assistance and equity, but I think this is a different set of resources that are addressing construction, and then how do we provide subsidy to businesses to have a path to ownership in those projects. Yeah.
Thank you. Councilmember Larmer, you're taking lots of notes. I don't know if this is for a later discussion.
It's a lot of information. I think what I'm struggling with is just really wrapping my head around what is the ask here? What is the suggestion? Is it taking our remaining ARPA money and applying it towards these pre-development barriers?
I think.
Is it applying for grants for these pre-development barriers? And then I also am concerned about, you're talking about staffing.
Yeah. So
what, I guess,
you're tracking me very well as how I feel, Councilman Larmer, with your 3 points. I think it's actually all of those. And so in terms of the information I'm looking for today, it's today information only, so I'm not necessarily saying this or that. But I am looking for a check-in, frankly, that when it comes to taking we already had sort of a conversation about commercial affordability. We've already moved over to the budget category of $1 million of ARPA. That wasn't going to go to the Flex Fund because we felt Flex Fund is well-resourced enough, actually, from when that was first considered. Here's another program, though, that we are talking about with National Development Council, right? So I just wanted to be very transparent about that. We're talking to them about Flex Fund, but I'm also talking to them about this commercial affordability thing. Maybe pivot as we look at the reality on the ground and talk about covering more of the pre-development costs. So what I'm talking about, and what I would have to come back to you for more guidance in future, is taking those fundings, and to your last point on staffing, maybe working with National Development Council to have them cover some of the staffing, basically outsourcing some of the program development. I'm not one for reinventing a wheel. If something has worked in City of Seattle or is already like 3/4 of developed in the City of Seattle, I have no problem with taking that same group and saying, well, let's get it 3/4 done here, but then put our unique Kent components to it, because there is a difference between the Seattle context and the Kent context.
Right.
And that's where I would be looking for more guidance still, maybe not today, but yeah. But I wanted to introduce it and then also talk about this King County grant, because frankly, some of the same organizations that I would have thought might take advantage of such a program if we created with NDC, they might be looking at this King County grant that's open right now and saying, well, how about that? So, but that is more narrowly focused in terms of its populations, and so that's another guidance area. Kent's a very diverse community, and we have a lot of needs, and so there's a prioritization conversation with council as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, we'll look forward to seeing you back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and that brings us to the last item in our agenda, which is adjournment. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. We are adjourned.